March 25th, 1911, Washington Place, New York City. When a United Press reporter saw smoke rising from a building, he ran toward it. "I learned a new sound," he wrote, "a more horrible sound than description can picture. The dead, the dead, the dead." The sound of a speeding, living body hitting a stone sidewalk. He counted 62 of them. This is the story of who those women were, what they had already fought for, and what the system decided their lives were worth. Every right you have as a worker, somebody bled for it. This is labor pains. To understand what happened on the 9th floor of the Ash Building, you have to understand the world that put those women there. In 1907, more than 1 million Russian Orthodox Jews fled persecution. The journey itself was its own ordeal. 12 days packed into steerage, below the waterline, with no air and no light and no privacy, among strangers who were sick and frightened and occasionally desperate in ways that made the darkness worse. They arrived at Ellis Island with whatever they could carry. New York had made no particular arrangements for their arrival. By 1910, 18,000 people a month were pouring into the city. They found tenements. They found each other. They found the garment industry, which is where New York's Russian Jewish and Italian immigrant communities landed. The work paid by the standards of the time. The conditions did not reflect that payment. 12-hour days. Some workers logged 84 hours a week, others 100. Between exhaustion, suppressed immune systems, and cotton rooms full of dust, tuberculosis moved through factories so reliably it acquired names. The tailor's disease, the Jewish disease. The culture was humiliating by design. Workers were searched when they arrived and when they left. Foremen timed their bathroom breaks. Minutes were shaved off their time cards quietly, week after week. Wages stolen in increments small enough not to provoke a lawsuit. The workforce was predominantly young women, some of them teenagers. And the fact of women working in industry at this scale was itself a provocation. Some men tried to drive them out entirely, threatened by the industry's appetite for replacing them with lesser paid women. Women who organized were targeted. Professional beatings, a service you could purchase, were common enough to be expected. Some women wore neckties to work, a deliberate signal to show that they knew they were working in a man's world and refused to pretend otherwise. Clara Lemlich was one of them. In 1903, at just 17, Clara had arrived from Ukraine. She had taught herself to read in Hebrew and Russian despite her father's objections, and arrived in New York with the same conviction that had gotten her in trouble her whole life, that things didn't have to be the way they were. She took a job in a shirtwaist factory. Within a year, she was organizing. Between 1906 and 1909, she was beaten by hired thugs so many times that she had 6 of her ribs broken on separate occasions. She documented each incident and kept organizing. She was poor enough, like every woman on those factory floors, that a strike meant literal hunger. A week without pay was a week without food. She kept organizing anyway. The shirtwaist, the item these women made, was having a cultural moment. It was a cotton blouse cut after menswear, looser than the Victorian bodices it was replacing, and hemmed above the ankle for mobility and to keep it off the dirty streets. Some considered it slightly daring. Everybody agreed it was modern. It was a class-busting garment. A shopgirl and a socialite could wear the same shirtwaist. The 2 men who made the most money selling this garment had ridden from the same streets as the women who made it. Isaac Harris and Max Blank arrived from Russia in the early 1890s and moved into the same garment sweatshops, Lower East Side tenements, and conditions as the workers they would eventually employ. The only real differences were that they were men and they landed on a higher rung of the social class. Harris was a tailor, Blank was an entrepreneur. They met through a family connection and recognized in each other what the other lacked. In 1900, they founded the Triangle Waist Company. By 1908, sales had hit $1 million. By 1911, they had moved to the Upper West Side. Harris employed 4 servants, Blank employed 5. They arrived at their factories by chauffeured car. Their company, the Triangle Waist Company, operating on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building, was the largest shirtwaist manufacturer in New York City. The industry called them the Shirtwaist Kings. The Triangle operated out of a new kind of factory, the loft model. High ceilings, electricity, multiple processes under one roof, machinery linked, and some lifted off the floor. It also had drawbacks the owners chose not to think about. Most of New York's factory workers by this point occupied floors 7 and higher, one floor above what the fire department's ladders could reach. Fire Chief Edward Croker had publicly predicted that a daytime fire in one of these buildings would lead to a terrible loss of life. But the owner's concern wasn't fire. It was theft and organizing. So the doors were kept locked during working hours. Max Blank checked them personally, obsessively, every time he passed. At one point, an insurance inspector had visited the factory, flagged the locked doors as a life and death concern, and offered to arrange a professional fire drill. He never heard back. The workers would later confirm the Triangle Fire was the first fire drill any of them had ever seen. Here's something worth knowing about Blank, Harris, and what one might cynically call their good friend fire. In 1902, the New York Fire Department responded to a fire on the 9th floor of the Ash Building. Thankfully, no one was working yet. Tens of thousands in damage, insurance paid. Months later, same building, same floor, another fire. Insurance paid again. $32,000 in damages, the equivalent of about $500,000 today. In 1907, the Diamond Waist Company, also owned by the same partners, caught fire before dawn. Insurance paid. 3 Aprils later, it happened again. Feel free to join in on this one. Insurance paid. By March 25th, 1911, Blank and Harris were carrying approximately $200,000 in coverage on the Triangle, roughly $80,000 more than the factory's total documented value. Now, there's a longer story to tell about the insurance industry in America. A series worth. Probably more. But for now, the short version is this. At this moment in history, insurance companies were not particularly motivated by factory safety. Safer factories meant lower premiums, fewer dramatic headline fires, and fewer fear-driven policy sales. The epidemic of shirtwaist factory fires by 1911 was described in industry circles as being fairly saturated with moral hazard, which, in modern terms, translates to somewhere between pretty sus and shady as f***. Blank and Harris were never charged with arson because they had an alibi that wrote itself. Who burns a factory with their own family still inside? But the pattern, the fires, the excess coverage, the routine consolidation of inventory in the Triangle before the end of each season, is a set of facts. Draw your own conclusions. With the writing on the wall, the workers had already tried everything available to them. In October 1909, a dozen women set up a picket line outside the Triangle factory before dawn. The owner's response was to hire scab workers to replace them, and to bring in prostitutes to accompany the scabs, the implication being that women who strike are no different from women who sell themselves. Then, the prostitutes attacked the picketers. Then the pimps joined in. Then the police arrived and arrested the strikers. This was not an aberration. This was New York in 1909, which ran on Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was the democratic political machine that had controlled New York City since the 1850s. Not merely a political party, but the entire operating system of the city. Police, courts, contracts, patronage, judges, politicians, all moving as a single instrument in service of whoever could pay them. The garment industry could pay for them. It had been founded in 1789 as a fraternal society, and, in the tradition of white men everywhere at the time, gave it the culturally appropriated name Tammany, after a Lenape chief named Tamanend. By the time boss William Tweed was running it in the 1860s and 70s, it had plundered New York of more than $200 million. Tweed died in prison. His machine did not. By 1911, under boss Charles Murphy, Tammany was still the power behind every police badge, judge's appointment, and political favor in the city that moved money from business to politics and back again. Strikers were arrested on fabricated charges. Women and children were sentenced to hard labor. The penalties were designed to be brutal enough to discourage the next attempt. It was the same system. And here comes the refrain. That dynamic was a feature, not a flaw. On November 22nd, 1909, at a meeting at Cooper Union, the male leadership of the American labor movement was doing what they often did, carefully weighing whether a general strike was advisable. AFL President Samuel Gompers spoke. Others spoke. The hedging continued. Then, Clara Lemlich, 23 years old, 6 broken ribs already to her name, stood up and asked to be recognized. She delivered a speech in Yiddish that nobody had planned for. She demanded an immediate general strike. The crowd voted by acclamation. Within days, 20,000 to 30,000 garment workers had walked out, the largest strike by women workers in American history up to that point. While a majority of factories settled, Triangle was one of the few that outright refused. They moved production out of the city, they hired strikebreakers, they waited the workers out. When the strike ended in February of 1910, Triangle workers went back without a union contract. Clara Lemlich was blacklisted from the garment industry. The people who died in the Triangle Fire in 1911 had been telling people for years exactly what was wrong. Nobody with the power to fix it had listened. Saturday, March 25th, 1911. The power was shut down. The machine slowed to a stop. It was the end of a normal Saturday. Workers were finishing their last orders, gathering their things, and heading for the door after a long, hard week near the end of the busy season. Someone started singing. Others joined. They had survived another week. They were together and headed for the part of life they more than deserved and yet never got enough of. Then, a cigarette ignited an 8th floor scrap bin, because cotton is more flammable than paper. The red fire pails were tried. No effect. The fire hose was tried. No pressure, no nozzle. A teleautograph, an early predecessor to the fax machine, was used to try to warn the upper floors. It didn't work. The telephone reached the 10th floor, where Blank and Harris scrambled for the roof with their families. 2 of the building's elevator operators, Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortiaro, heroically made numerous trips to rescue workers, despite the dangerous and deteriorating conditions. On the 9th floor, workers had learned about the fire when they smelled the smoke, but when they rushed the nearest exit, the Washington Place stairwell, the door was locked. From the street, the fire department's hose only reached the 7th floor. The ladder? Only the 6th. New York's political environment at the time allowed the building to be built without a 3rd staircase. Instead was a flimsy fire escape that couldn't hold more than 1 person at a time and terminated over a skylight, not the street. It lasted mere minutes under the weight of panicked workers, sending them careening to merciless deaths of impalement, mass laceration, or outright impact, stories below. Outside on Washington Place, a crowd had gathered. They saw what they first believed were bundles of cloth, factory materials thrown from the upper floors. By the time the second hit, the crowd understood. The sound alone, a journalist had written, was something he could and would never forget. 30 minutes after it started, the fire was under control on all 3 floors. 146 people were dead. All but 23 of them women, more than half the workers on the 9th floor. The youngest was 14. The oldest, 39. Many were unidentifiable. There was no reliable list of victims. And, in what's likely the most telling fact of this entire story, the owners couldn't even produce the number of people working that day. One more detail about March 24th, 1911, the day before the fire. The New York State Court of Appeals struck down a new workers' compensation law as unconstitutional. It interfered, the court found, with the due process rights of employers. The workers who died the next day had no legal mechanism to seek compensation, even if they'd lived. Harrison Blank hired Max Steuer, widely considered the best defense attorney in New York. His fee was $10,000 per man, payable in advance, enough to pay 40 shop girls for a year. Steuer was himself an Eastern European Jewish immigrant, and his work, before becoming a lawyer, was so ironic even Alanis Morissette would be impressed. As a child, he worked selling newspapers, then matches, before pulling threads in a garment factory. Once a lawyer, he had built his career through Tammany Hall's network. Politicians, gangsters, the highest of the highs. He had a memory like a machine and the instinct to use it against people who were telling the truth. He had come from the same place as the women on the 9th floor. He put that knowledge in the service of men who locked the door. In court, he didn't even try to prove the door was unlocked. He didn't need to. Judge Crane's instructions required the prosecution to prove not only that the door was locked, but that the owners knew it was locked, and that a specific named victim would have survived if it had been open. The bar required near omniscience. Steuer dismantled witnesses methodically. He caught Kate Alterman, who gave the most powerful testimony of the trial, describing how her friends disappeared one by one into the flames in a word-for-word repetition of her previous account. The repetition was proof of coaching, not fabrication. Steuer made the jury hear them as the same thing. The jury of 12 men, many of them businessmen, deliberated. The initial vote, 8 for acquittal, 2 for conviction, 2 abstentions. One by one, the holdouts caved. The judge's standards and instructions, they said, left them no choice. Harrison Blank were acquitted. For the first time in the courthouse's history, they were escorted out a side door to avoid the crowd. The civil suits were eventually settled. Each victim's family received $75. The insurance company paid Blank and Harris $64,925 more than their documented losses, approximately $445 per dead worker. Some families lost everything. Blank and Harris had made a profit. Then the pattern reset. Just 5 days after the fire, the triangle reopened. Different building, same conditions. Frances Perkins was just 30 years old, near the same age as many of the women she had watched plummet to their deaths from the street below. She had spent years studying social conditions in New York, conducting surveys, collecting data, pushing the argument that suffering was a policy outcome that policy could change. What she witnessed in 1911 was not an abstraction. It was specific. It had a sound, and she was determined to make it deafening. She understood something that most reformers and union organizers of her time didn't, or wouldn't. Labor unions and progressive reformers despised Tammany Hall, with good reason. But Perkins recognized that nothing would change without its machinery, and nothing would rehabilitate the machine without their moral weight. So she did what idealists rarely do. She worked with what existed. She pushed progressives into Tammany's orbit. She organized unions and reformers behind the new figures who were emerging from within it. She made the alliance that nobody wanted to make, because she wanted the bills more than she wanted clean hands. Within 2 years, the political landscape of New York had shifted. Tammany Hall, the infamously corrupt machine that had protected business owners and beaten strikers for decades, finally faced the math of 146 bodies. Charles Murphy, its head, recognized both the moral outrage and a political opportunity. He ushered in headstrong progressives like Al Smith and Robert Wagner, who were hell-bent on serious labor reform. In 1912, they passed 25 labor reform bills, some of the most significant worker protection legislation in New York's history. The machine that had protected the Shirtwaist Kings became, through a combination of political pragmatism and genuine outrage, the vehicle for protecting the workers they had killed. It wasn't righteousness, it was arithmetic. But the bills were real. Frances Perkins would spend the next 30 years building on what the fire started. If you're wondering what happened to Blank and Harris, well, they just went on being themselves. In 1913, Max Blank was arrested for locking the doors of his new factory during working hours. the judge apologized for having to fine him. In 1914, Blank and Harris were caught sewing counterfeit Consumers League safety labels into their garments, falsely certifying that the clothes had been made under approved conditions. As time does, a decade later, when the Union commissioned a history of the labor movement, the Triangle Fire received only a brief mention. But what was seemingly doomed to abstraction was ultimately saved from it. Leon Stein, a Union man and a man of letters, spent years in the 1950s tracking down survivors and poring over transcripts. He saved what little remained recoverable. He wrote the only full-length account of the fire for the next several decades. History had nearly succeeded in burying it. On September 3, 1991, 80 years after the Triangle Fire, 25 workers died in a flash fire at the Imperial Food Products plant in Hamlet, North Carolina. The exits were locked. The owners had locked them to prevent theft. On April 24, 2013, the Rana Plaza garment factory in Bangladesh collapsed. 1,134 workers died. Workers had reported cracks in the building the day before and had been ordered back to work. The clothes they were making were headed to stores in the United States and Western Europe. In 2025, the Trump administration moved to dismantle OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, created in 1970 specifically because 100 Triangle Shirtwaist fires had proven that workplace safety does not happen voluntarily. The official, appointed to oversee worker health and safety, had previously managed health and safety operations at Amazon and UPS, companies that together had accumulated over 300 workplace safety citations and $2 million in OSHA fines during his tenure. The 146 people who died at the Triangle Waste Company on March 25, 1911, were not victims of a random tragedy. They were victims of a system that had decided, in every specific choice it made, that their lives and the lives of their friends and families were less valuable than the cost of bad press and profit. So the next time you bid your friends farewell after a weekend, the next time you hug your kids or kiss your partner goodbye as one or both of you head off to work, remember what it takes to keep them safe and what it would mean to lose them. Protection isn't a person, and it's not a party. It's policy, and good policy doesn't have a color, but it does have a sound.
Show me what community looks like. This is what community looks like. Show me what unity looks like. This is what unity looks like. Show me what community